this one I'm going to look at the Ensoniq SQ series of synthesizers and modules, not to be confused with the ESQ1, also by Ensoniq, which is a very different type of synth. If you're interested in what they sound like, I've already done a video about that, link on the screen and in the description. Before I start, if you'd like to support the channel, then please check out some of my tracks on the usual streaming services and Bandcamp. Again, links in the description. So let's get into it. I think the first thing we need to look at is the different types of SQ synth. Ensoniq were continuously upgrading and expanding this line from 1990 to 1992. As a result, there is a significant amount of variation of types of the same synthesizer that you can get. So initially Ensoniq released the SQ1 and the SQ1 back in 1990. The SQ1 is essentially a Rompler-based workstation. You have a sequencer, you've got 24 voices, you have quite an extensive collection of drums, and finally a fairly extensive effects section. So if it's got an R in the name, then it's a rack unit, and it's essentially a cut-back version of the SQ1. Clearly, there's no keyboard, but there's also no sequencer. So it really is just a sound expander, but it does have full programmability in the same way as the SQ1. Anyway, for whatever reason, Ensoniq decided that that wasn't quite good enough. So in 1991, they came back and they released the Plus versions of the SQ1 and the SQ1. Now, the main difference with this is they expanded the ROM side to include more detailed piano sounds, but the rest of it is essentially the same. The other change was that they introduced the SQ2, which is the same as the SQ1, but with a bigger 76-note keyboard. Clearly, these enhancements were not enough because in '92 they came back again, but with a 32 version of all three of these devices. And then to cap things off in the same year, they then released the KS32, which is again a 76-note keyboard, but this time with a weighted piano action keyboard. But it's still only 76 notes. So that makes you wonder, perhaps that would have been a time to go for a full 88 note, but for some reason they decided not to do that. So now I've run through the different types of SQ. Which one should you go for? Well, I suppose it's always nice to have the biggest and best. There's also a certain amount of convenience with the rack unit. But there are a couple of things that you should bear in mind. If you feel that pianos have moved on and you're quite happy with piano tech or something along those lines, the enhanced piano isn't really going to do much for you. In the same way, if you are working on a DAW, then having 32 voices as opposed to 24 isn't really going to make that much difference either. If you need more voices, then you record more than one track. It's as simple as that. Then really you've got the space limitation. Obviously a large 5-octave keyboard in the case of an SQ1. It's quite nice to have the immediacy of a keyboard, which is my preference, but clearly there are some benefits to just having a rack unit which doesn't take up so much space. The one thing with the rack unit though is that there is a significant disadvantage, and that is when it comes to programming you don't have as many buttons on the front. And I'll demonstrate that later. I have the rack unit, so I can't do too much of a comparison, but I can see what is on the SQ1 front panel. And it does look to me like it would be significantly easier to program than the SQ1. Right, it's time to look at the architecture then. So I won't go over every single detail. You can see from the diagram that there's a lot of things that you could potentially talk about. So let's just go for the main things, and then you can puzzle over the diagram yourself some other time. So first let's talk about the Rompler side. So each oscillator is essentially a sample. There are 121 to choose from, and that does include conventional waveforms as well. I suppose the main emphasis is on the capture of acoustic instruments, which is quite typical of its time. Now, one of the other things that is of particular interest for anyone that wants to investigate Ensoniq is the Transwave waveforms. And there are 9 of those included, which isn't as much as some of the other Transwave synthesizers, but at least you get a taste of it. So the next thing is the filter, and there's some good news and some bad news. On the good side, there's actually 2 of them, and they can be combined in various ways for you to get all kinds of responses. On the negative side, there is no resonance, but the filters themselves are very effective. So yeah, it's a shame about the resonance, but it's one of the things that was relatively typical of the time when it came to digital filters. I guess a generous way of looking at it would be to say that you can therefore expect a different type of sound, and I think that is very much true. But there's no pretense of any analog modelling going on here. It was way before that time. The last section is an amplifier with pan control as well. Most of the modulation sources are fairly standard, so you have a dedicated envelope for the pitch, filter and the amplifier, but there's only one LFO. Now this can be routed any way you want it to go, so that's fine, but I would say that's a bit of a limitation, but that is made up for in other ways, as I'll explain in a second. Going back to the envelopes, they're all 5-stage, but they have some additional features. So you can repeat the envelope, which could then turn it into an LFO. There's also the finish mode where the sustain is disabled, so it will just do its cycle, and if you want it to repeat, then you have to re-trigger the note. So one suggestion on how you could get the most out of your LFO would be to loop the pitch envelope so that you can use that for vibrato and you don't tie it up with the oscillator. After all, it's the pitch envelope is the one that people tend not to use quite so much as the others. Well, at least in my case, that's probably true. You're almost certainly going to want an envelope for filter and for amplitude, but you might want the LFO as well. You don't really want it tied up with the pitch. Although the LFO is not dedicated to a particular module, it can be assigned to more than one thing. So as long as you don't mind the same frequency being used on more than one element, then it's not really a problem. Now, in terms of other modulation sources, you've got plenty of them. There's plenty of velocity options. There's plenty of keyboard scaling options. As I said, wasn't going to go through absolutely everything. It's just really a quick overview. One thing I forgot to say was that each patch can have up to 3 voices layered within it. Now this reduces the polyphony because you're using 3 voices for one note's polyphony. So in that case, you can end up with just a standard 8-note polyphonic synthesizer. But each one of those notes is using 3 voices. Now obviously the 32 voice version will help to alleviate that to some point, but it's worth bearing in mind if you were using this within a MIDI studio that you may find yourself running out of voices a lot quicker than you expected because you're using more than one on a patch. So finally get to the synth itself. Now I've got the SQ1, which gives me a lot less real estate when it comes to the front panel compared to the SQ1. How much difference it makes in terms of programming? Well, there's certainly going to be quite a few more button clicks in order to get to the various areas that you want to look at, but it may not be too bad. I'm not sure. So let's start with the basics. How do you get to patches and what exactly is available? So there's 3 types of patches. You've got the internal patches, which is what I'm set on at the moment. You've got the ROM patches, which are read-only and can't therefore be changed. And then you've got the drum patches as well. So I'll just quickly show you how you get to those. So if you go to the Select Sound button, then you basically toggle between ROM and internal. And then in order to go up and down a patch, you just use these up or down button. There's quite a few patches, so you're not going to want to scroll through the whole lot of them. So you can go, if you use this left-right button, then you can go up in tens, which is quite useful for getting around, as long as you can remember which number it is you're looking for. Now, when you get to a certain level, 81, you can see that it changes to drum, and this is where the drum patches are. Now, they're always at the end. They're the same set of drum patches, but if you scroll up beyond a particular point, so I think in this particular case, so internal 79, if you go above that, you're into the drum territory. Now, if I go down here and I'm going to swap back to ROM, and again, if I go up, I'm into drum territory, but it's the same drums. It's not like there's internal drums and ROM drums. If you do want to make your own drum kits, then you can set one of the internal patches to be a drum kit. So that is an option. Now, when it comes to the programming then, this is where it becomes a little bit more difficult. So on the SQ1, there's a button dedicated to each section of editing, which is referred to as banks of editing parameters, perhaps, I don't know. On the SQR, as I said, you've got the limited button. So how do you get around? So it's actually not too bad. Okay, I go back to the air choir. Pleasant enough sound. So if I want to edit that, then, as you would expect, you go into the edit sound. The first page you come to then gives you the choice of being able to edit all three voices at the same time, therefore setting them to the same values. So an example of this might be you want to set up the same envelope for all three voices, but then later on you might want to change the waveforms so that they're different. This is how you could do it and save yourself a bit of work. As you can see, I'm on all at the moment. If I go down, I'm editing voice 3, 2, 1. Now, at this stage it's set to all. Now, if I set it to one of the voices, that you then get the opportunity to go down to the lower line, where at the moment it's just saying on. So let's go down to, I'm going to set it to voice 1, meaning that I'll only be editing voice 1. I can then go down to this bottom line where I can choose one of three settings, so on, off, or solo. So if I'm just going to edit voice 1, then it would probably make sense to set it to solo. If I change it back to where it was, so you can hear all three elements going at the same time. Now I'm down to 1. At this point then, I'm able to go in and start editing things. So I've got the waveform. So at this stage, what I'm doing is I'm toggling through the different groupings of waveforms. So there's drums, there's percussion. There we go, the famous Ensoniq Transwave, that's what we're all looking for. You can hear the way it's sort of phasing almost. So I'm in Transwave. Now I want to go over to the second line, so I'm using the left-right button, so I'm on Formant X. Now at this point it's going to change not the grouping but the actual waveform. The Transwaves do have a particular sound to them. this is perhaps one area where you might be able to pick up some of the resonant sounds that you're missing from not having a resonant filter. And once you get to the end of a set of waveforms, then it takes you into the next group, so you're not sort of locked in. That's just crazy. I love it. Wow. So you might think, well, where's all the other stuff you want to edit? And this is where, on the SQ1, the buttons become quite useful, because you can just say, well, I want the filter, clonk. But on this one, you have to press the bank button, and it's something you have to hold down. So I'm going to use both hands. So that's the wave bank of parameters. Got outputs. And again, you would just tap through, find the setting that you're interested in, change it. But if you want to then go to a different bank, then you just press the bank select again. You've got the amp, envelope 1, envelope 2, filter bank. So talking about the filters then, although there are 2 filters, they are linked together. There are only 4 poles of filtering available. So the first thing then is to basically change the mode you're in. And then you can look at things like cutoff frequency. Now this is where perhaps we'll get an opportunity to hear the quality of. I'm going to go for a 3-pole low pass on filter 1, and then I'll go back to the frequency. A basic sawtooth. We all know what that sounds like. So now I'll go back to the filters. I'll use the envelope as my cutoff. Yeah, so you can definitely hear, okay, it filters, it's fine. It's not ringing through with bags of character or anything, but it works. I think that gives you some idea then of the difficulties with programming it. Now, I think it's going to be easier on the SQ1, but at the same time, is there really going to be that much difference? Because I think the problem you've got here is, but I've still got to scroll through a gazillion settings to get to the one I want to change. And when I do want to change it, it's all up, down, waiting for the thing. And it's a pain. I really want my sound creation experience to be a little bit more friendly than this. So I think while the device actually has a lot of capability, and there's a lot of things I would like to play with, I don't want to do it through this front panel. It's just too annoying. It's as simple as that. Sound Diver, which is still kind of available, is able to talk to this, but it just ended up crashing the device when I used it. So that was unusable. The only other option I found is KS Edit, which should be able to run on 32-bit Windows XP. So I suppose you could run that in a virtual machine, but then you're getting kind of technical about this stuff. It's not the sort of thing the average user would be able to do. And I tried it in a virtual machine. I also tried it on an existing XP piece of hardware, and I could not get it to work. So in both cases, there were either issues with the software or issues with the driver. Unfortunately, I was not able to make it work, which was extremely frustrating, because I think the way in which you would want to get the most out of this would be through an editor, and it's just not available. I mean, I think if all you really want to do is change something like the release time or something like that, it's not too much of a pain to go in and just go for a particular thing that you want to change. But if you want to create a sound from scratch, this is going to be such a pain to work with. I personally just don't have the patience, and it's a real shame because I'd really like to be able to get more into it, but I just can't. You know, it's just too much of a pain. So yeah, so it's sort of disappointing from that point of view. I wish Ensoniq had stuck with their original display technology. The SQ1 was really good in that regard, although there was a lot of functionality. It was very easy to get around. A little bit of practice and you could get in there and program things without too much difficulty, even though it had a great deal of capability. So that's it from me. Hope you got something from that. Hopefully catch you on the next one. Bye.